All right. I think we can get started. Great. Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Patrick Kent, Director of the Board of BPEI and a Portfolio Manager at Newton Investment Management. For those of you new to the webcast, the Biophysical Economics Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c3 organization of scientists, economists, investment experts, corporate and project finance analysts, and policy professionals. Together, we're working to bring the natural sciences into economic analysis and decision-making. Our mission is primarily educational as we seek to build understanding of the vital role that energy plays in economic and human life. The Institute's funding derives from a combination of membership dues, private donations, and public sector grants. We have our first research grant actually live. You can find the link at the website for someone who may be interested in applying for that. And as for upcoming webcasts, we will also have Cesar Hidalgo, who's done phenomenal work on information theory on May 24th, and Adrian Bajan, a professor whose work around something called the constructal law in these proposed in thermodynamics. He's coming on June 16th. So if you share our deep commitment to protecting our environment and supporting human society through careful stewardship of our precious natural resources, please consider becoming a member of the Biophysical Economics Institute or making a donation at our website. But now it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, a conversation with Gillian Tett. Gillian almost doesn't even need an introduction, I think, at this point. She is a renowned journalist, author, and anthropologist, best known for her work at the Financial Times, where she is the chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large, the U.S. She writes weekly columns covering a range of economic, financial, political, and social issues, and has co-founded Moral Money, the FT's sustainability newsletter. She's also the author of several books, including Anthrovision, How Anthropology Can Explain Business and Life. Gillian is known for her interdisciplinary approach, drawing on anthropology, economics, and sociology to shed light on complex social and cultural phenomena. Her unique insights really allowed her to see the trouble the financial system was in the lead up to the financial crisis before it was apparent to many others. So with that long-winded intro, welcome, Gillian, and thank you for joining today.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I am both fascinated and intrigued and very excited about what you're doing as an institute. It sounds absolutely terrific. And I'm doubly interested because one thing I should also mention en passant is that, I'm currently chair of the editorial board of the FT. From October, I'm also going to be provost of King's College in Cambridge and splitting my time between Cambridge and the FT. And between the US and UK, and very much champion the kind of interdisciplinary approach, the new approach you're taking towards, economics and the environment. So it's terrific. Delighted to be here.
Oh,
I should also explain to anyone watching, apologies for the fact I'm talking in a car. I'm actually, like many of you, probably picking up one of my daughters from college right now, and I was supposed to be doing a Zoom call in her room, and she's actually sitting her own economics exam right now, and so the room's locked out and the common rooms are too noisy, so apologies for that.
We're just glad to have you here. So great. Well, I'll maybe start. I'd love to get a little bit of more of your background, I guess, around your role as an anthropologist, because even in your book, you talk a little bit about doing field work in your PhD and then ending up at the FT. And I'd like the superhero origin story a little bit of how you went from an anthropologist PhD to where you are sort of today, or how you originally made this move sort of into financial journalism.
Well, I'm basically an accidental financial journalist in some senses, in that I was indeed an anthropologist initially. I worked first in Tibet, Western China, and then I went to Tajikistan, which is the Soviet Republic, former Soviet Republic, next to Afghanistan, and did a very classic bit of field work looking at cultural anthropology, studying, a village up in the high mountains to see how Islamic culture and the Soviet identity interacted or didn't. It was back in the days of the Soviet Union, which, as my daughters often tell me, makes me officially very old. And I was looking at the ground and what was happening. Then the Soviet Union broke up spectacularly, dramatically, and with tremendously tragic consequences where I worked, because there was a very bad war. I started writing about the war initially for human rights reasons, and one thing led to another. And I got hired by the FT and told that I couldn't stay on the FT if I was really just going to be a small war reporter. I had to go and, get trained in finance and economics. And my initial reaction was actually, that sounds really boring and a lot less glamorous than being on the front lines. But then I realized that actually that was totally wrong, because the way that money goes around the world matters enormously. And if you want to understand the world, you have to look at money. But I also realized that how most people look at how money goes around the world is driven by a sense of tunnel vision, and that they only ever look at essentially what's happening, within a very narrow framework of economics. I'm seeing this actually just, looking at my daughter's course that she sits her exam right now. And to be honest, I realized that if I tried to combine my unusual background of having cultural anthropology as a lens, and anthropology is very much a discipline devoted to looking at the world bottom up, observing it with a worm's eye view, not a bird's eye view. It tries to look at all aspects of society and how they interact. And it tries to look at what people don't talk about as much as what they do talk about. They're baked in assumptions, what we call social silences in anthropology. I realized that if I tried to use that lens and look at economics and finance, it might give me a slightly different perspective. I hope a slightly richer type of journalism. And so that's essentially what I've been trying to do for the last 30 years of my career. And what's fascinating is that until 2008, that approach was really, viewed askance. Very narrow, rigid, macroeconomic orthodoxies dominated.
Mhm.
And if you tried to take a sort of broader perspective, it was seen as very hippy-dippy and suspect. Post 2008 and the financial crisis, that started to change. I would argue that there's in fact now a tremendous amount of change in the economics discipline and the financial discipline, a world where even someone like Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater, who used to only ever talk about capital flows and economic models, a world where he's spending most of his time now talking about society and politics and culture, and it should be said the environment, is a place where economics is changing and finance is changing. So frankly, in some ways, I feel like I've come full circle.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, well, one thing I was going to ask you about is over 30 years of that career since then, are there ways that you can continue to retain sort of that child's view of things, even though at this point you're very much an insider to the financial world, but yet trying to maintain sort of an outside observer's sort of view of things?
Well, that's a great question, because the essence of anthropology is really that you go on a three-part journey. You try and plunge into something that's not familiar to you, to, as we say in anthropology, make the strange familiar, by essentially going into a completely different landscape, almost like a child, and trying to relearn what's going on and to understand it. And, that is very valuable, both because it enables you to get to grips with a different culture. And actually, give me 10 seconds. I'm going to quickly put on close the windows. Needless to say, a leaf blower has just started operating. Just next
Always. It's usually either a dog barking or a leaf blower. It's always
semester. And in fact, I parked in the middle of a field, and lo and behold, a leaf blower has just turned up. Anyway, or grass cutter. But anyway, I've shut the windows. But the key point is that, so anthropology is a three-part journey. First part is you go into somewhere completely alien and act like a child with a sense of wonder and, unquestioning observation, and try and look at what's really happening in any kind of social or cultural context. And the reason that's important is that when you're familiar with a environment, when you've grown up with it, everybody is trained to screen out vast numbers of what they see around them, large parts of the world, because they take it for granted. And so you often ignore the most interesting things that are sitting literally just beneath your nose, hidden in plain sight. So you go into a situation with childlike wonder, but you use it not just to try and understand someone else's culture or an environment and get more broad-minded and know more about how the world works. And that matters in a world where we're very globally interconnected. But you then try and use that experience to do the same thing in reverse and turn back into a child into your own environment, to look at it with childlike wonder again. And the reason that matters so much is that doing that is a key to looking at your own assumptions that you don't normally notice and thinking about how they distort your perspective on the world. I can give some examples later on if you want about how that works in practice.
Yeah.
But the problem is that in reality, when you spend time in any environment, and particularly when you become powerful and competent in any environment, which probably most of you are, you're all experts in your field, you've probably all got, very important day jobs, et cetera, et cetera. When that happens, then essentially what it means is that you stop looking at the most obvious things, the parts of the world the most important elements are shaping your perspective.
Yeah. I mean, you made reference to this, I think, in your TED talk too, this idea of the cartoon of the fish in water, right? How's the water today? What's water, right? That you get lost on your inability to see the things around you that have just become habit and it's unclear exactly why we're even doing those things, or maybe it's not always explicitly clear to us on a day-to-day basis. And only by sort of dissociating yourself a bit to a higher level and trying to observe it without judgment, can you sort of see those patterns?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very hard thing to do. And I'd say it's a particularly hard thing to do if you are in a position of power and authority, and where you've been trained to think that you're important, and also where you think you're successful, because often it's in conditions of maximum success, so it's very hard for people to actually see what's really going on. But that's precisely where it's most important. And the classic example of that is during the great financial crisis, because the people who understood how, say, credit default swaps or derivatives worked at that period in time, they, for the most part, just took for granted many parts of their everyday world, like the fact that they were very cut off from the end users of the products they were creating. They had these wonderful models which were supposed to explain, what would happen to these, say, credit default swaps or collateralized debt obligations, default risk, and things like that. They spent all this time using all this maths to try and explore what was going on. But they didn't actually get out and actually do bottom-up 101 observation of everything that was going on and look at culture. And as a result, they missed some really basic things, like the cultural pattern of or attitudes towards default risk changed quite significantly in the early noughties, whereby it became a lot more acceptable culturally to default on your mortgage loan. Partly because historically people had defaulted first on credit cards, then auto loans, and then mortgages. That flipped around in the early parts of the 21st century. And so by failing to look at their own assumptions, by failing to try and get a worm's eye view on the world, they missed a lot of the risks.
Right. And there's also sort of this idea from, physics of the uncertainty principle, right? That once you've observed something and then acted on that observation, you've kind of altered the course of what you've actually observed in the first place. It's like, so when we look back at the housing crisis, right, there was always this discussion of, well, we've never had a national housing crisis. It's only been pockets. It's never been the entire housing market. And so therefore, they felt confident in then putting leverage on top of something, which by definition then made us have a nationwide financial crisis.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a fantastic financial sociologist in Edinburgh called Donald Mackenzie. And if anyone on the call hasn't read his book, An Engine, Not a Camera, I'd very strongly recommend you do, because he made the very obvious point that, we have all these tools in finance and economics to seemingly take snapshots of the world. And we think by doing that it stays static. And of course, it doesn't. The very fact we create snapshots and then use them changes the world. The very fact that we create, indices, or metrics to measure those indices with, isn't a neutral observation. It then goes forth and drives investor behavior in a way that changes the value of the indices. So one of the fundamental problems with economics and finance that you touched on in your introduction is that it's based on this very Newtonian model of how physics works. And frankly, we ought to be probably using, reflexivity and relativity a la Einstein. And yet, ironically, all of those major breakthroughs in physics, and it should be said mathematics, that came out in the latter part of the 20th century were rather, swept aside within the world of economics.
Yeah, very good. And that's actually a great segue, but I wanted to talking about sustainability and a little bit of where the trends that I want to talk about and using your sort of anthropological view of these things. But before we go there, I actually wanted to curious as to you talk a little bit about this in your book before we leave the financial crisis component behind. In your columns and in your book, you've talked about this a bit. I'd love to sort of get when a few anecdotes of observations you had which gave you those sort of first insights into like there's a much bigger problem developing here. I'm just kind of curious if there are like key moments that come back to you when you think of your memory of those times.
Well, the one that I've sometimes cited because it ties into my weird background is, if I go back to the 2008 financial crisis, in 2005, I went to a big investment banking conference down on the Mediterranean. And I remember walking into that and thinking, wow, this is just like the type of Tajik wedding rituals I used to study when I was an anthropologist. Because, investment banking conferences or any conference in the modern professional world basically does what a big tribal wedding ritual does in the Himalayas. You pull together a scattered tribe, you enable them to essentially recreate their social ties through formal and informal rituals. And you also enable them through that to both reflect and reproduce a shared worldview with all of its assumptions that people ignore. And, in the case of the European Securitization Industry Forum that I observed in 2005, essentially, there wasn't dancing and tribal feasting going on. It was basically all PowerPoints and golf trips and things like that. But what struck me was that there were these embedded social silences. One of them was the fact that very few bankers were actually getting out into the communities which are taking out subprime loans. And they considered that normal. I mean, I was very struck by the fact that all the PowerPoints that were put up had Greek letters and algorithms and equations and charts. They didn't have people's faces. And it was taken for granted that finance had become this very disconnected activity, which was quite abstract and quite mathematical, but very much removed from the people using the products. A bit like sort of Plato's cave, where people could see shadows of reality flickering on the walls, but not actually be living among it. The other thing that struck me as, in retrospect, is quite funny, was that everyone kept talking about all this innovation and securitization through the lens of liquefaction. And by that I mean, the holy grail was perfectly liquid free markets, and that was taken for granted as being good. And as a reflection of that, they were championing mark-to-market accounting. Wonderful. Except that the products which were supposed to be driving this liquefaction, or the CDOs, were so darn complicated and complex that they weren't actually being traded very much at all. And there wasn't really a free market to ascertain their prices. So they were pricing them on the books off the back of rating agency models. So there was a key intellectual contradiction there in the very heart of their whole paradigm, or as I sometimes say, their creation myth. And I say creation myth not scornfully, but just realistically, because every single professional group has a creation myth, journalists included. Creation myths always contain huge ambiguities and contradictions by their very nature. But the insiders can almost never see them, precisely because they're insiders and don't have that insider-outsider childlike wonder and questioning. So that creation myth turned out to be incredibly important in blinding the bankers to the problems, because they kept saying, we've got mark-to-market accounting, we're creating a perfectly liquid free market, we're distributing risks through these new channels, it's making the system safer. And they couldn't see the contradiction in their mark-to-market idea. They couldn't see how they were cut off from the end users of their products. And they also couldn't see that the very tools they were using to supposedly distribute risk to make them system safer were introducing new risks.
Right. Well, to go back to your point, right, the reflexivity of this, it was then creating bad behaviors, was being sort of not really observed as part of this modeling. Yeah.
And I might say that very quickly. I mean, that's ancient history in some ways. But if you think back to a comparable example recently in the crypto land, the whole creation myth of cryptocurrencies is that it's all about distribution of risks, no centralization, everyone's equal, you don't need to have essentially gatekeepers. And that's been the dominant mantra. Well, that is, to use an English term, total bollocks in terms of how the reality is actually played out. In the sense that actually what groups like, FTX and others were doing, in some ways Binance today, was acting as a hyper-centralized platform to a greater degree than anything you see in the non-crypto world by combining the roles of broker and custodian and market maker and sometimes proprietary trader all at once.
Right.
So again, we have to challenge our creation myths.
Right. Correct. So this is great. I want to try to segue this a little bit. Now, I'll do this probably in a ham-fisted fashion by giving you a little bit of my own background on sort of how I came to looking at sustainability or ending up at Biophysical Economics Institute. So I, as a proud member of Gen X, now aging up, I came into this industry and basically I saw in the first 15 years of my career managed to see 2 1-in-100-year sort of events happen in the financial world that implied to me that maybe it doesn't quite work the way we think it works, and so it sort of is like, where are we starting to reach points where our conceptual idea of how the system functions is running up against maybe some binding constraints that allow the system to function the way we think it could or should. And that's where sort of coming to ESG sustainability at the time, people talked about, peak oil or energy constraints. There are other things that have come along those like that. And I'm kind of curious, as an observer of trends that you are, when did you first begin sort of following the ESG sustainability, like as this, has grown into, certainly within the financial world, like a whole, industry / sub-industry around this practice?
Well, thanks for asking that. I should mention that the first time I started thinking about the natural sciences and how that dovetail with economics was actually after 2008, when a particularly brilliant economist at the Bank of England called Andy Haldane used a series of papers to explore how economics could and should learn from the natural world and think about its own operations. And if any of you haven't read Andy Haldane's papers from the period, I'd urge you to do so. He made a wonderful analogy back then that banks had become a bit like the Amazon jungle, in that they'd all evolved and adapted into one single identical niche. And from the outside, they looked really strong and very impressive as a kind of forest. But if something went wrong with that niche, they all got wiped out. And that was a very useful, image that, carried a lot of weight. But in terms of thinking about the environment and sustainability, to be honest, it didn't cross my radar screen at all until about 2014, 15, 16. Because although, I've actually, been quite, environmentally aware and, in my past, and, something that a lot of anthropology departments at universities, tend to be pretty anti-establishment and progressive. I, like most people, saw the environmental issues as sitting in a completely different silo from the world of finance and business and economics. Physically within the FT, we had entirely different teams that had very little connection with each other. And if you look at society as a whole, the people who were campaigning for environmental change were either scientists or, my ex-fellow anthropologists wearing tie-dye and chaining themselves to bulldozers. They weren't the people sitting in CEO suites or central banks. And that really started to change, in my view, around about 2017, where it turned out I was running the FT in America then, and got a lot of emails from people talking about ESG. And my first reaction was actually just to delete them all, because I thought, gosh, how boring, how irrelevant. We were all completely obsessed with Donald Trump at the time. And the idea of companies telling you how green they were seemed a bit kind of hippy dippy and, an awful lot of corporate PR spin. And then I spent time actually looking into why I was getting all these ESG emails. Again, one of the central tenets of anthropology is that, when somebody's trying to tell you something, you have to be really careful not to impose your own judgments on it and not listen, or only listen to the parts that you want to hear. You have to basically try and think yourself into their mindset about why they're telling you that. And so I spent time actually trying to get in the minds of the ESG world and realized there was a really big shift going on in business and finance about how they saw the world. And essentially, they were beginning to realize, if I was going to put it very crudely, that the models they've been using in the late 20th century to navigate the world with were very useful as tools, but only as good as the inputs you put into those models. And the stuff that you left out of the models could matter enormously if the context of those models was changing. And, by 2017, the context of those models was changing rapidly. You had climate change, which had been knocked out of most of the models before, the 21st century, but actually was really starting to matter. You had social risk. You had things like #MeToo. You had political risk. You had rapid technological change. And so all the stuff that had been traditionally viewed as externalities to the models or footnotes in the balance sheets were suddenly the central part of risk for companies and central to the models. So I realized actually most people, though they couldn't articulate it, were beginning to realize that if they were in the business of managing risks, they had to look at the environment. They had to take a wider view. Otherwise, they'd get, basically tripped up.
No, it's great. It's exactly how I've sort of described it over the years. I mean, I got involved with the sort of more officially with sort of sustainability when I helped to launch the Wellington Global Impact Fund back in 2012, and that was sort of even before the UN SDGs had been published, and then behind that came this wave of more and more of the growth in ESG. And early on, I would talk about it a little bit in those terms, and I feel like now that's been more broadly accepted as that terminology of like understanding that the models, when you had theories and a system relative to the environment it was in that was small, the population was small, the resource intensity was smaller, the energy use was smaller, the complexity of the system was smaller. There were large parts of it that were irrelevant to the model, and therefore their error terms did not really show up in the outcomes that you would expect. But now that we've reached a size that is, orders of magnitude bigger than when we first theorized some of these things, the error terms become quite meaningful. And in fact, what we're finding is that there are whole, portions of whether it's natural services, natural resources, like the waste assimilation capacity, right, of the biosphere, if you look at carbon that way, that are being sort of depleted but never accounted for, right? So now that's not really part of the math. So that leads me kind of where I wanted to go with this. So as you gaze at this and how this has now evolved from your first thoughts about it in sort of 2008, 2009 to getting more formally involved in 2015, 2016, gazing at this world of sustainability ESG as a child, what are the good, the bad, and the ugly of this trend that as you see it, like as it's begun to take on its own momentum and permutations? I'm curious to sort of how you think about things that have been positive, things that have been negative, things that are downright maybe terrible.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think your framing is very, very good. ESG, like every other creation, every professional group has its own creation methodology. And there's been another contradiction in the ESG creation methodology for some time, which is one reason people like me sort of rather ignored it, for a while. And it's basically, ESG enthusiasts have presented themselves in the past as basically trying to save the world and do good. And certainly many people are driven by that general motive. Some are dedicated to it, and I salute and hail all of the impact investors, all of the people who've really fought to try and stop us from polluting our planet. But the hard reality is that the reason why ESG boomed in the last few years is to do with risk management, and is a case of many company executives and financiers not so much trying to save the planet as save themselves, and to avoid reputation risk and stranded assets and losing their customers or their employees or their investors, et cetera, and that's no bad thing, because actually, having watched real life revolutions unfold in places like Tajikistan, I know that what makes a revolution stick is not whether a tiny minority of deeply committed idealistic activists shout loudly. It's whether the silent majority of people in the mainstream who want a quiet life decide it's easier to go along with them rather than try to resist that. And that's kind of what's happened in recent years. I mean, I was very struck. I was at Harvard early this week, and Harvard have just had their first ever Climate Week, Climate Action Week it's called. which is trying to unite the different Harvard departments to come together. That's quite no small feat. And it's very striking that, when you've got even Harvard, who's been very late to the game, standing up and shouting about this, the mainstream establishment is beginning to realize that they need to get on board rather than resist it. So that's one point I make. The second 2 points I make is that there are many, many problems with some of the ESG metrics and the way that these metrics are structured and framed. One of the obvious ones is that it doesn't distinguish a lot of the time between inputs and outputs. And most people don't actually talk about double materiality, let alone know how to measure it. There are lots of flaws, not at all surprising whatsoever, because guess what? Any new financial innovation has tremendous amounts of opacity, label confusion, flaws, etc. ESG is the same. But the reality is that even if you think the acronym ESG is problematic, and we probably use it less these days ourselves at the FT because of these issues. But even if you don't like ESG as a label, what is really going on, and what I don't see changing, is this desire to have lateral vision as opposed to tunnel vision about how finance and companies operate. Because when I talk to people who are involved in the ESG backlash and say, oh, I hate ESG, it's all woke capitalism, you can't, or else they say, actually, I love the environment, but I hate ESG because the way the inputs are constructed is terrible. And ESG is basically putting a burden for action on companies instead of governments, and governments need to act. When you talk to them about all that, nobody is saying, actually, I hate ESG, therefore I want to go back to the very rigid vision of economics that Milton Friedman had, and just
right.
just look at stakeholders. Nobody's saying I want Milton Friedman redux at all.
Well, ESG itself was always a strange admission, right? Because it's an odd thing. Like, it's almost like this, it was bundled together as an unwanted child that then had revenge on the parent, right? Because we put environment, social, and governance. Governance was the biggest weight of this, something on the order of 65% of these measures, right? Or governance. And yet that's a strange admission from the financial industry to say, oh yeah, we weren't really looking at governance, but now we're going to really look at it. No, we're really serious this time. Versus and looking at the environmental and social parts of this as saying, well, what we're trying to really get at here is pricing these externalities. And it's a very strange way that we've come to it through scoring methodologies. It's like this real weird proxy system for trying to rank to create how much potential liability or risk is in your model relative to these things then on a relative scale to everyone else, as opposed to actually trying to maybe even attempt to price those externalities explicitly, right? Which would seem like maybe to make more sense, might be more difficult, but to make more sense.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more in some ways, because people who are involved in this whole movement were worried that they weren't being taken seriously by grown-up business and financiers. They set about trying to ape what they thought were the keys of getting credibility, which was metrics and scoring models and ratings and things like that, which I can understand entirely. I mean, you had to have something to plug into the system. But of course, they aped some of the very worst aspects of the existing models, because guess what? Credit ratings normally are full of problems. We know all this. Just look at what happened in the last few months in the banking sector. So, it's no surprise that the ESG label is problematic. I always thought it was going to be problematic. And one of the reasons why I called the FT's sustainability platform that I created Moral Money instead of ESG Express, which was one of the other, phrases we looked at. Yeah. The reason I didn't use the word ESG was I was worried that it would actually end up, running into problems. And I hate acronyms. Moral money was supposed to invoke the theory of moral sentiments from Adam Smith, but that went straight over the heads of 99% of our readers, and they thought I was trying to be religious and preachy, which I wasn't. But I guess if I have to really summarize it, it's all about having lateral vision, not tunnel vision, about what business and finance are doing. And that means, of course, looking hard at what the natural environment is doing. If I was to call the newsletter something today, I might call it cleaner capitalism, because that's really what we're trying to do.
So as I guess one question I wanted to get into is where, you were very clear about your views in the lead up to the financial crisis, and something that came up, I think on a webcast that you were hosting, or you were, I think it was a McKinsey webcast I looked at, and then also came up a little bit on your Bill Maher interview. And the question I'm dying to ask is, first of all, did you get to meet Quentin Tarantino or not? I wasn't.
I did, and he was charming.
All right, excellent.
And
Sorry,
totally different from what you expect. Actually quite gentle.
yeah, he's as I say, I started at the beginning. I said I was a proud Gen Xer, so of course Quentin Tarantino falls right into that into the cliche. But your topic that came up was a little bit the prediction, the trillions of dollars of projected kind of gap in spending on energy transition and sustainability, right? And I'm sort of curious, again, from your viewpoint as sort of the observer, the anthropological observer of this, do you have a prediction at this point as to how this resolves itself? Because it does feel a little bit like we're running into a immovable object and an irresistible force, right? Like, so I'm just curious to sort of to hear how you think about
it. Well, several points. Firstly, there is an ESG backlash going on. There is a lot of, foot dragging and greenwashing and all of that. There's also this new phenomenon, green hushing, which is companies doing quite a lot but not wanting to talk about it. So that's the first point to make. The second point to make is that, when I look around what companies are doing and what investors are doing, in spite of the backlash, and actually in spite of the green hushing, there's actually an awful lot happening, and it's accelerating in a way that's quite exciting. I was at the Milken Institute conference last week or 2 weeks ago, and almost everyone I speak to is factoring this into their business strategy in some way, if nothing else, as a way of risk mitigation. So that's striking. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act has really unleashed a lot of excitement about investing in green infrastructure and green renewable energy in different ways. So that's great. Will that be enough to stop the planet warming? 50-50, frankly, to cite people like Jeremy Grantham and Mark Carney, because, many parts of the world are not racing down this path right now, most notably the emerging markets and China. And that's because, there's a fundamental problem that the countries which did not, pollute the world through industrial revolution want to catch up, and they don't have the money to necessarily do that in a great green way. And, one of the biggest questions right now is whether the World Bank and other financial institutions can actually find a way to channeling money into the emerging markets to try and tackle this or not. It's been absolutely disastrous up until now because very little has happened. The World Bank has been a big blocker. I'm told, and I was told earlier this week at the Harvard event, that there's a tremendous amount of activity right now and discussions around things like the World Bank, around the forthcoming summit that Macron is having with Mia Mottley in Paris. And Mia Mottley is the head of Barbados, to try and look at reforming the international financial architecture to get more money flowing to poor countries. But in many ways, the game right now is not simply about whether you can persuade the Republicans to stop blocking green projects, but also to see whether you can actually get the emerging markets, the developing world, to get properly on board. And the last point I'll make about the Republicans is that, I am always very struck when I look back at the history of the environmental movements in America by the fact that in the 1960s, it was a bipartisan movement. The time of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, it was Richard Nixon who created the EPA. I think there are ways to talk about this battle which are less alienating to Republicans, except for those who are wedded to the oil and gas sector. And even those these days are increasingly realizing where the future is heading. I very much hope that anyone who is involved in the money business can try and find ways to actually treat this as a bipartisan approach, not a partisan approach.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was going to ask you, given the political and regulatory pushback, I'd argue across the US from a political perspective, I think you're seeing it in a regulatory perspective across the EU, right? Because, they've been cracking down now on sort of sustainability funds, anything that's sort of tried to market itself as sustainability impact, Article 8, Article 9 funds, they've actually been busting many of them down, right? Because they feel like this has grown too quickly. And now there's this overriding need to try to regulate it and control it, which is also has its own sort of unintended consequences. But I sort of wonder, is there sort of a basic inability to agree on facts that undermines the chances of like making real change happen and stick, right? whether it's on the one hand, like, examples, right? Whether it's the Republican Party trying to gut the IRA in the current in its current form, or it's even, Germany shutting down the last of its nuclear reactors, despite the fact that now its per share of its power going from coal and natural gas has only gone up, because renewables are intermittent and they haven't been able to take on. And it is Germany. I mean, solar panels are only going to be so powerful, right? So I just feel like you get this point where, like, there's sort of the vision of where they'd like it to be, but is not acknowledging the reality of what the end result or the unintended consequences of those things are.
Yeah, I mean, the transition in Europe has been very badly handled, and the invasion of Ukraine has really exposed that. The good news is that you're seeing explosive adoption of renewables now in Europe on the back of the energy shock from the invasion of Ukraine. The bad news is that there are some really, really nutty, things happening on the continent. I personally think that closing down nuclear power stations right now was absolutely crazy. So it's hard to say. I mean, what is clear is that there's a growing acceptance that renewable energy is the new normal, and that there's going to have to be a lot of investment in this. When you get groups like the IEA saying, that actually there needs to be, however many trillions of investment in renewable, and basically investment in oil and gas needs to stop. That's a huge paradigm shift that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. So the cultural fabric and framework and assumptions is shifting, but it may not be fast enough.
Yeah, well, and I'd argue too, to think of it from the standpoint of a historian or an anthropologist, that's an undertaking that, while acknowledged more broadly, the scale of that is sort of not really well internalized, right? That we've had an energy system in its power and complexity that's been built up over, arguably centuries, if we go back to the start of coal, but certainly in the last 100 years, since sort of the introduction of the automobile and the change of how we think about transport and power production and usage, to replacing that in a finite amount of time to sort of rip and replace an entire infrastructure, is arguably unprecedented on the scale of history.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wonderful book, if anyone's not seen it, called How the World Really Works.
Yes.
By Douglas Sim, which basically underscores that point, about, the degree to which both the remarkable energy revolution has driven most of our progress in the last few centuries, and the degree to which it's now embedded in our assumption of what normal is and is needed to keep our, economies functioning. And I have a lot of sympathy for those who say, actually, it's just not going to be possible to wean ourselves off oil and gas as fast as people want. Because it's not, if we're not willing to accept some hit to living standards. But that absolutely does not mean that we shouldn't be racing to install as much renewable infrastructure as we can, and using the private sector financial pools to back that. Yeah. And it's quite striking when you look at, whether it's solar panel usage in Germany and how that's exploded in the last year. When you look around the debate about renewable heat pumps, when you look at the adoption of EVs, if you look at the fact, I was on the West Coast last week and saw had demonstrated some planes which they're going to try and introduce into the regional airline network in America, which run off hydrogen. Very clever system for making them run off hydrogen. I saw hydrogen trucks, and EVs are everywhere. Things are changing, but it may not be fast enough.
Yeah, no, I made this point in a presentation a few weeks ago, and that there's we look at the input outputs of in the US specifically. You could do this on any country, I suppose, but the US actually does have these numbers published that the energy in versus the work you get out, and we waste 67% of the energy that we create doesn't actually go to the end work that we could do with it, right? A lot of that has to do with electrification and sort of moving toward more of those processes electrifying, but that does take really re-engineering the entire system to be more operating along those lines, which will take time, and unfortunately probably also be very carbon intensive, since we don't make many renewables with renewables today. But so given, I guess that's sort of, I'll segue maybe one last question for me, and then I'll see if any from the audience we want to touch on. So are we guilty at all of magical thinking when it comes to many of the proposed solutions for energy transition? Because you, as an observer of financial markets, know, like, anytime there's sort of like a rush to put capital into something is a recipe for bad decision making. So I just think of this as, like, our magical thinking could be along a couple of different vectors, right? It could be along the relative scalability of solutions. Something that works at small scale actually may not be great if you try to scale it up as a large solution in a very short amount of time. The unintended consequences of scaling, like we talked about with renewables in Germany, right? And then you've had this increased reliance on gas imports, or the constraints to scale. So as we talk in the EVs, we famously talk about this in terms of cobalt, right, as parts of the battery, and copper, and like all of these things that I think the cognitive dissonance of many sustainability-minded folks is that they sort of don't want to look at the mining component of this, but yet obviously any and all electrification projects are massive engineering and construction projects, and incorporating a lot of steel, cement, copper, and other metals.
Well, the answer is there's a lot of magical thinking, and all of the things, example, are absolutely examples of magical thinking. And that is bad, and as journalists we need to call that out, and we need to keep exposing it and pushing people to do harder. I would say, though, that actually I'm not in the camp who says that what we should be doing is just gotcha journalism and showing the hypocrisies or the contradictions, because actually some of the bits of magical thinking are actually helping to spark a wider change in zeitgeist and cultural shift. By way of example, recycling plastic bags. If you as a consumer go into your grocery store and reuse your plastic bag, is it going to save the world? No. Is a little bit of tokenism there, but at least it gets you thinking about the footprint you have, and you start looking at the world with more of a lateral vision, to put it crudely. So it's a bit like the ESG label. All of these things are very useful as helping us to reset our mentality, and to go back to where I started, try and embrace lateral vision, not tunnel vision, and think about the mess we create and how to clear it up.
So maybe I'll paraphrase a question that came in, and I'll apologize in advance to the whoever submitted it, in case I get the gist of this wrong. But how do you think about sort of the addiction to growth, when in reality there may necessarily be a need to diminish the pace of growth in order for the natural systems around to actually not sort of go bankrupt themselves, right? And that we rely on around, even if our intentions are great, right? We're like, but even pushing very critically forward in transitioning the energy system very quickly is by itself a very carbon intensive activity, and therefore you're actually potentially making the problem worse in the near term to hopefully make it better in the longer term. But I don't know, I'm curious to sort of, in your observation, I mean, what would it take for that mindset to truly be accepted, or is that impossible in the way we've structured like the culture of like economics, finance, corporate profits, that we cannot in any way even contemplate a slowdown to that?
Well, the reality of capitalism is that one of its guiding principles is that competition is good because it creates more innovation and more growth, and that you basically take the surplus profits to basically fuel the next round of investments into innovation and more competition and growth. And yes, that has a fundamental contradiction, but the reality is that no politician is going to stand up and embrace green policies right now, if they hope to get elected. So I think we have to work with what's realistic and doable right now, rather than what's not realistic and doable. I think over time, given our demographic time bomb, with the aging population, there is going to be a steady realization that rapid growth is not possible in the way that we thought in the past. And everything from the fact that the Fed's, basically revising down its sense of productivity expansion, its natural rate of return, et cetera, et cetera. All of that indicates we're moving towards a shift, but no one's going to be able to promote green policies effectively by saying that up front.
That's great. Gillian, we got through almost almost 15 minutes and we didn't even talk about AI, so I won't even try to bring that up and stuff it in, even that it's it is
Thank
definitely the topic of the moment that I'm sure everybody wants to chat with you about. Well, I want to just thank you again so much for taking the time out to chat today. And just a reminder to everyone who joined, please follow us on social media if you don't already, or visit the website to donate or to continue to be involved in the mission in some other way, and stay updated on additional webcasts in the coming months. So I won't keep you trapped in your car any longer.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I should just say, from my point of view, before I go off to, engage in the joyous task of shifting boxes from my teenager's room in Connecticut, it's what the work you're doing is fascinating. Very much salute it. And thank you very much indeed for having me on your podcast.
I appreciate
it. On your webinar.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate it. Have a good rest of your week, and good luck with your trip to college there.
All right. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks.
Bye.